Okay, we'll get things underway because we have some introductions to go through anyway. So if anybody's joining us a little bit late, they won't miss out on the key information. So welcome everybody, and thanks again for joining us for tonight's webinar, which will provide an overview of the Marinus Link environmental assessment process, including updates about our studies and investigations and potential impacts. My name's Mandy Davidson, and I'll be your facilitator for today's session. Before we get started, I do need to advise you that we'll be recording this session and it will be uploaded to the Marinus Link website later. Some quick housekeeping before we get underway, and we'll have a slide just to show you a little bit about our Zoom functionality tonight. Today we'll be using the Q&A tool for questions. You'll see that Q&A button just down at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions here at any time, and you'll also have the opportunity to like or vote up the questions if you see something that you're interested in hearing a bit more about. Because we're in a webinar environment, you won't be able to turn your microphone on or use the chat function. Thank you very much to those who told us before the webinar what they were interested in or who submitted a question. We've done our best to incorporate those themes into today's presentation, but if you do feel that we haven't covered something that you were interested in, please use the Q&A to ask a follow-up question. Before we get underway, we have some introductions, as we have some new faces to the project team for those of you who've been following our progress for some time. So we'll invite our panellists to turn their cameras on and say hello. Online today, we have Stephen Clark, who is our project director, Jason Purdy, who's the Executive General Manager of Strategic Communication and Community Engagement, Kate Gard, the Head of Environment and Planning, Mark Lindsay, who is our Engagement Manager, and Stuart Edney, who is a Converter Project Engineer. Now, we understand that some people might have questions about the Northwest transmission developments. As these are outside of the scope of Marinus Link, we're not able to address them today, but we will be very happy to pass them on to the Northwest Transmission Developments team. We've got a busy agenda tonight, which you can see on the screen, but we are aiming to conclude the session by 7:15 and hopefully a little bit earlier. As I mentioned, you can post questions at any time, but I'll facilitate a Q&A session with the Marinus Link team when the formal presentation has concluded. Any questions that we don't get to in this time will be recorded, and we'll do our best to answer them offline. So that's all now for the introductions. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Mark.
Thanks, Mandy, and it's my pleasure to be able to formally welcome people and provide an acknowledgement of traditional owners tonight. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Bunurong people in the southern reaches of southern Gippsland, and I'll be able to share some information later on in the presentation around the work that we're doing, an important work we're doing with our First Nations community across Tasmania and in Victoria. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country in which Marinus Link is proposed in Tasmania, across Bass Strait and in Victoria. We recognise Aboriginal people's continuing connection to land, sea, waterways, sky and culture, and pay our respects to all elders past and present. Thank you. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Palawa people in Litruwita, Tasmania, and I just wanted to put some framing around everything that we're going to be talking about tonight in terms of why we're doing this. At its heart, I think Marinus Link is a story about the environment and our need to adapt to climate change. If we look at the next slide, it is going to be a really important part of our nation's transition to a lower carbon national energy market, and that's one of the reasons why all of the people at Marinus Link are so passionate about the project and its promise of delivering a better world for our current and future generations. And if we look at the next slide, it really provides a range of benefits, which includes access to the cheapest and most reliable energy for our customers and business and people across our communities. It's going to deliver an enormous amount of employment and new industry across all of the places that we operate. And it will deliver an enormous amount of sort of capacity for growth in our local and state economies, both Victoria and Tasmania, but also strengthen resilience for our communities. So this project is going to be delivering benefits across those areas, and we're just looking forward to sharing the project update with everyone who's attending tonight.
Thanks very much for that, Jason. I'm now going to hand over to Stephen.
Thanks, Mandy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project update. We've got the slide up. Great, thank you. So first off, the government partnership. October last year, the government announced a really groundbreaking tripartite agreement. The Tasmanian government, the Commonwealth government, Australian government, as they like to be called, the Victorian government, three-way arrangement to support Marinus Link, to support the funding, the ownership, and resolve the pricing issues around Marinus. So that agreement really paved the way for the project to move forward. As well as that, working with the government, we've also now embarked on our tender process. We've shortlisted 7 international companies who are excellent in their fields of producing cables and converters. And we are now in the process of running that tender process through interactive workshops with them, with a closing date of around the middle of the year for those contracts. Part of those tenders and the framework that we're doing that is to require these tenderers, although they're international tenderers, to actually work and partner with Australian companies and local companies in the areas that we are impacting. And an important part of the evaluation of each of the tenders from these suppliers will be how well they've actually achieved that, how well they've achieved partnering, creating and sustaining jobs in the local area around there. So a really important aspect of the tender process and that evaluation. And we're starting now to do this securing of this critical equipment, because even though we're planning to have this link go online in 2028, it's really important that we lock in supply of those critical equipment, long lead time items now, to make sure that we're ready for when we hit FID into 2028. As well as the tenders we've got running through now, we'll also be running some tenders next year as well for some of the civil activities. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the ways you can get involved with that later in the slide pack. In terms of other things which are happening on the project, we've also got some exciting new changes on the executive leadership team. So we have now a new CEO, Caroline Wycamp, who started earlier this year. And unfortunately, she can't make it tonight, but she's brought renewed enthusiasm and energy to the project, and is a very passionate supporter of the project and supporter of addressing climate change that Jason just mentioned. And of course, the other new member of the executive team is Jason himself that you just saw. So we welcome Jason in the new role of strategic comms and community engagement. Okay, I think that's me and Mandy.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I think now we're handing over to Kate to talk about the environmental impacts. Thanks very much, Kate.
Thanks very much, Mandy, and good evening, everybody. I'm speaking tonight from Nipaluna, Lituita, Hobart, Tasmania, the land of the Palawa people. This evening, I'd like to give an update on the environmental approval process that we're going through and the technical studies that we've undertaken. So as some of you may be aware, we've been decisions have been made under the relevant authorities to assess the project under the following key pieces of legislation: the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of the Commonwealth, the Victorian Environmental Effects Act, the Tasmanian Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act, and the Tasmanian Land Use and Planning Approvals Act. We were previously proposing to prepare the one set of documents to address all of the requirements of the Commonwealth, Victorian and Tasmanian approvals processes. However, owing to regulatory requirements and time frames, we've now decided to separate these out. We will retain, however, a coordinated process wherever possible, including the alignment of the advertising of the environmental impact statement documents. They will also all include the same suite of rigorous investigations and studies and involve heavy consultation with stakeholders in the community throughout the life of the project lifecycle, including tonight. The 3 sets of document approvals are going to be one set of combined EIS-EES, which addresses Victorian and Commonwealth jurisdictions, one set of documents that responds to the requirements of the Tasmanian EPA and Burnie City Council for the converter stations, and one set of documents for the Tasmanian shore crossing. The environmental approvals timeline. So we have been started in September 2021 when we submitted our referrals under the key piece of legislation and is expected to be completed by late 2024, end of next year. We're currently in the preparation phase of the environmental impact assessment, which involves undertaking the investigations and studies that I'll talk about tonight, as well as gathering community and stakeholder feedback to understand possible impacts. So with regards to the studies and reports that we've been preparing, you can just move to the next slide. You can see a range there of a high level. We're about 22 sets of separate studies and reports are undertaken. And these are being done at the moment to inform the environmental approval documentation. We've got a couple of studies yet to completed, but most of them have been done. And we want to tell you about what our findings are so far and the possible impacts. And the ones that I'll speak about this evening are those that have been of most interest to the community to date from feedback. And all of our studies and reports will be available in early 2024, so around February, during the public exhibition process. They will be attached to the environmental approval documentation. The outline of the studies are that each study area is based on an aspect, for example, those that are listed on the table, like air quality. Impacts for each one of the aspects are assessed, which also includes fieldwork, and then environmental performance requirements are developed for each aspect, and these are outcome focused. Our approvals will be based on these environmental performance requirements as agreed with the individual assessment agencies. When we appoint a contractor, we'll provide them with the approved performance requirements, which then they can achieve through innovation design and other construction management techniques. Performance requirements include such things as creation of specific management plans, monitoring, consultation with the community, and notifying prior to works. We'll talk you through some of the initial findings and the proposed management in the slides to follow. Thank you. So noise and vibration. So we're expecting potentially, we've done some studies to determine noise and vibration and potential impacts, particularly to people and places during construction. We've recorded the noise levels to date so that we've got an understanding of the baseline conditions at the moment. And as with any major project, we are expecting changes to noise and vibration levels during construction program. Most of our works, the construction works, will take place during normal working hours, and out of hours works will be limited to those unavoidable activities that cannot be stopped once they're started, such as horizontal directional drilling and pouring concrete. The Environmental Protection Authority in both the states, Victoria and Tasmania, have protocols in which the state have used for the guidance to assess the expected operational noise for the converter stations, and the predicted operational noise levels are proposed for the converter stations are below those. However, this will depend on the equipment being used and the final design, and we can talk about that a little bit later on. Once the final designs are complete, a noise model will be created to ensure compliance with the local regulations. About that. Air quality. We've also done assessment to determine how dust-causing activities and other impacts from air quality may affect the air quality during construction of Marinus Link. We've looked at how they may impact the health of plants and animals and humans, both in the operation and construction phases, and the maintenance of buildings, machinery and equipment during construction. Construction activities will generate dust, but measures will be implemented to reduce impacts on the environment and nearby properties. And dust will be generated by earthworks and trenching for the cable and trucks travelling along access tracks and haul road, and it's expected, obviously, during dry months. The majority of residents in the vicinity of the cable route are more than 300 metres from the works area, so dust is not expected to present risk to human health. Management approaches for managing air quality. A construction dust management plan will be prepared, how it will be reduced and managed during construction, and will minimise exposure to soil and other materials likely to generate dust. Traffic. We've also undertaken a traffic assessment to determine potential traffic and transport impacts during the construction, operation and decommissioning phases of the project. Impacts include access tracks, including detours and temporary road closures, traffic delays when moving large project materials, increase of construction traffic, including the heavy vehicles, any vegetation removal required to widen access, and road upgrades and remediation before and after construction. The traffic assessments are used to prepare a technical report which identified ways to manage and mitigate impacts on local road users. And they include developing a transport management plans, which will set out coordinated approaches to managing and minimising impacts, and designing a road transport plan, which will allow for different traffic levels and conditions, upgrading of roads and crossings where required, and ensuring that pedestrian and vehicle access is reinstated in line with road design standards. These measures will ensure minimised disruption to road users, including other vehicles, pedestrians and cyclists, meaning that the roads operate within their capacity and accommodate project vehicles. The road network is safely used throughout construction. Townships and communities are not unreasonably impacted by the project, and road networks will be reinstated to pre-project state following construction, noting that Victoria will be subject to more potential impacts than Tasmania. Groundwater and surface water. Groundwater is important water source. We recognise that for both people and surrounding environments. So our specialists have been assessing groundwater conditions and how they may be affected by construction activities. During construction, we may need to remove groundwater, dewatering, to ensure construction occurs safely and to stop water from seeping into the site. Some construction activities may also affect the levels of volume of groundwater and impact how groundwater supplies flow into the nearby environment. The impacts, removal of groundwater and levels, and small risk of accidental spills from machinery or vehicles that may cause contamination. Surface water have also been assessed, and that for the project would be during construction. The majority of impacts to surface water would be during construction. Some of the impacts from the project may include flooding on users and assets within the floodplain, existing flow paths and changes in flow direction, and any activities that may damage water courses and in turn leading to erosion, habitat changes. We've assessed the potential impacts of flooding and diverting stormwater over that area, and potential increases to sediment and contamination release. We will be developing surface and groundwater management plans that detail how the project may impact those particular water resources, and to develop mitigation management measures at how to ensure that flood risks and potential to contamination will be avoided and managed. We'll also be undertaking modelling to ensure temporary works and assets don't increase overall flood risk. Contaminated land and acid sulfate soils. So some of the area we've identified has got contaminated land, including waste, along the route. And so we've undertaken studies to identify where they may be, as with areas or pockets of potential acid sulfate soils. Acid sulfate soils contain sulfides, and when they've been extracted, as they usually lay within waterlogged area over extended periods, and get mixed with oxygen after they've been extracted, can cause sulfuric acid. So it's something that we're taking very seriously. To date, we've identified 5 potential hazards in the contaminated area: excavated soils, contaminated waste, waste from construction and operational activities, and the acid sulfate soils. We will be developing environmental management plans to address the contaminated land and separate acid sulfate soils along the route. And obviously the first one for the acid sulfate soils is to ensure that we minimise as much as possible the extraction of acid sulfate soils, and when we do, to manage them so that they become inert and therefore don't leach out sulfuric acid. Which it's naturally occurring. Agricultural production. Many of the landowners and other community members have been very interested in our potential impacts to agricultural production along the route in Victoria. and there may be some potential impacts taking place on private properties, causing changes to land use and farming activities in the interim. We understand the significance of the impacts of people's livelihoods and local agricultural industries, and have been working closely with impacted landowners to manage changes on their property and what it will mean for their farming practices and production. Potential impacts include restricted access to areas of property required to safely install the land cables, establishment of access tracks, laydown areas and site offices, and any vegetation clearing where cable trenches are proposed, including crops, pasture, etc. Other potential impacts may be the accidental introduction of pests and diseases for biosecurity, traffic changes, and accidental introduction of contaminants to organic farms, which we have a number that we're aware of along the proposed cable route. During operations, there's also potential for us to impact limitations on land use for operation and maintenance works, and the introduction of pests and diseases, again, for biosecurity or contaminants. Our management approaches are ongoing engagement with landowners and agricultural industry to understand and discuss the potential impacts and mitigations. We're developing individual property management plans in consultation with the landowners, including biosecurity and organics requirements, using horizontal directional drilling to avoid sensitive areas and deep water courses, and using existing roads and tracks wherever possible, and upgrading to facilitate construction traffic as required in consultation with individual landowners. We'll also be remediating disturbed areas after construction. We take biosecurity very seriously, and any concerns that individual property may have about that. We've engaged organic certifiers to understand their requirements and how proposed activities will be undertaken without impacting organic certification. That's right. Ecology. We also have undertaken extensive terrestrial ecology surveys and managed and assessed the impacts, originally on the desktop review and then field surveys to follow. The potential impacts during construction are the clearing and vegetation for access and work areas, habitat fragmentation, indirect impacts to health and reproduction of vegetation and habitats, fauna interactions with vehicles, spread of pests, plants and diseases, and erosion. And during construction, during operations, similar sorts of impacts, minimal clearing of vegetation, animal interactions, dust from vehicles, and any potential plants and animals that we may bring. So our management approaches will be minimising vegetation removal, horizontal directional drilling under areas of sensitive vegetation and watercourses. We'll be doing arboriculture assessments where arboriculturists will be trying to ensure wherever possible that we maintain the large trees, minimising habitat fragmentation, maintaining all mature and remnant trees wherever possible, and native vegetation offsets and waterway protection. Few areas left now. Another major area that we're looking at is cultural heritage. We're completing our site walkovers with traditional owners to understand if the project will impact Aboriginal cultural heritage. Our surveys aim to identify Aboriginal and cultural heritage sites and areas of potential archaeological sensitivity along the project alignment. Things such as artefacts, stone quarries, and culturally modified trees, as with areas of cultural significance. The findings from these walkovers will be used to develop cultural management plans, CHMPs, and these would detail the measures that the project will put in place before, during and after works to manage the protect cultural heritage, Aboriginal cultural heritage. With a photo showing two traditional owners walking along Waratah Beach just prior to us undertaking the geotech investigations on the beach there. Underwater cultural heritage and marine ecology. So we've undertaken underwater cultural heritage and archaeological studies to look at potential landscapes, shipwrecks and other items of significance which are underwater. While there are shipwrecks and areas of submerged cultural heritage identified in or near the investigation area, the project we've found to date, unlikely to have significant impacts on these areas. If areas of underwater significant heritage are identified, the preferred approach is to avoid these features and manage the impact. Marine ecology. we conducted studies, and you can see there in the photo that that's a diver under at the bottom of Bass Strait there, to evaluate the impact of Marinus Link on the marine ecosystem, including seabed habitats, plants and animals. The study was conducted in 2 parts across Tasmanian and Victorian waters. The cable route has been designed to and selected to avoid rocky seabeds, and the alignment follows primarily sandy habitat, avoids cobble reef and isolated patches may be present. There was one threatened seabed that has been identified with no other sensitive species or habitat, benthic habitat found. There impacts on marine mammals were also assessed, but were found to be low, and that's particularly in relation to EMF, electromagnetic fields. Our management approaches will be to avoid wherever possible, and we'll be monitoring for presence during and after our works. And finally, in addition to all of the, what I've just spoken about, we will also be adopting design and constructability considerations, or at least acknowledging and managing those. We've got a very changeable topography and soil types along the route, and engineering approaches and construction methods are considered to take these into account. The project is also looking at climate change parameters and risks, how the project is addressing those, but also how climate change may impact the durability of the project. And we've also taken into consideration sea level rise into our investigation into the project design. So that's all I have at the moment, but I'll pass on to Stuart Edney, who will speak about converter stations next. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kate. Yeah, my name's Stuart Edney. I'm one of several engineers working on Project Marinus Link, with my focus being the converter stations. I guess one of the best ways to think about the converter stations as part of the project is they're actually the only part of the project you'll be able to see once the project's completed. Everything else will be either under the ground or under the ocean. The reason we need the converter stations is Marinus Link is a HVDC, or high voltage direct current interconnector, which is different to a traditional overhead AC power line. It's marvelous technology. It means you can run very long cables under the ocean, and it's essentially the sole reason that we're able to run high voltage cables underground in Victoria, because of the high voltage direct current. The downside is we have to convert it. So where we connect to the Tasmanian power system and to the Victorian power system, we have to have these giant converter stations that convert from AC to DC and vice versa. And they're really the terminus of the interconnector. They're the termination point at the northern and the southern ends. In northwest Tasmania is where we've chosen the location of our Tasmanian converter station, just outside Burnie, at a location called Haybridge, as shown on the left there. And we're aiming to use the old tie oxide factory. Anyone who's familiar with this area of Tasmania will immediately recognise this as the large patch of ground where the old tie oxide factory used to be. With connecting into the Tasmanian AC system from the south, and our undersea cables leaving to the north under tie oxide beach and into Bass Strait. In Victoria, our preferred location for connection is near Hazelwood Terminal Station, as shown in that image on the right there, immediately south of the existing switchyard. And from the outside, it'll look much like an extension to that switchyard. That's not to be confused with Hazelwood Power Station, the recently demolished site, which is a few kilometres to the north west of the location shown on that map. This is near Hazelwood Terminal Station, just south of the existing Geraldine Power Station, and slightly north of Churchill, if you're familiar with the area. The next slides we'll get into, yeah, this is a little bit more detail, zooming into each station and exactly what they look at. There's nothing terribly out of the ordinary as far as power industry equipment occurs here. Everything that's visible from the outside: transformers, circuit breakers, switchgear, filters, control buildings, all typical stuff you would see in a substation. The really fancy and really interesting, cool stuff that actually does the AC to DC power conversion will all be inside two quite large sheds that will pretty well resemble Bunnings sheds, although with a Marinus colour scheme, probably not one that looks like a Bunnings shed. Well, that's pretty much what they'll look like in terms of what they'll sound like. They're not, they're quite inoffensive structures. As I said, all the normal noises you get from an AC, a substation, are relatively quiet. There is some additional acoustic emission coming from the cooling systems of the actual valves, but as Kate mentioned earlier, we're going through an assessment process to show that to ensure that that has an insignificant impact on the amenity in the local area. And we're doing a heap of work to make sure we mitigate that down to a level that will be acceptable. That's the Tasmanian end, the Victorian end on the next slide. Yes, the actual converter plant and AC switchyard itself is identical to the Tasmanian end. The key difference being that we're also including an expansion of the 500 kV terminal station to the north that will be undertaken by AusNet Services in all likelihood, and then we'll be connecting into there. Other than that, from the outside, it'll just look like an extension of the existing terminal station. That's pretty much it from me. So I think I'm handing over to Mark now to talk about community engagement.
Good on you, Stuart, and thank you very much for that really informative piece there on converter stations. And there's been a lot of detail that has been shared, and thank you, Kate, also with regards to the EIS and EES process, and some updates on some very important technical information and studies that have been undertaken. I guess there's going to be many questions from tonight's webinar, and certainly there were some really informative ones from yesterday's webinar as well. But I'd like to assure everybody who's in attendance, and thanks very much for doing so, that there'll be many an opportunity to be able to provide your feedback, and I'll just run through some of those in just a moment. Now, our session tonight, session yesterday, and some recent activities that have been happening in Tasmania and over in Victoria all forms part of our EIS engagement process. Now, we're guided by a consultation plan that we work with our technical reference group to create, so that we're responding to community needs, and we're providing the information that's required to make informed decisions and provide informed questions to the project throughout the duration of the design and approvals phase. Now, all of that information contained in the consultation plans available on our website underneath the environment approvals page. Now, the upcoming program that you can see on your screens now, there's quite a number of engagement opportunities in Victoria, plus the webinars that we're having right now, and they're taking place over the next 2 to 3 weeks. What we are going to do at each of those sessions is have subject matter experts attend so that they can answer your questions. So the information that Kate shared and information that Stuart just shared too, there'll be people on site to be able to answer any of your questions related to any of those parts of the project, whether that be environmental or around the converter station sites. Now, I just wanted to make a mention of a great opportunity for everybody that's online tonight. And you'll see down in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a URL forwarding you to our engagement webpage, where you'll be able to access a number of really valuable resources, including community updates, newsletters, the consultation summary, so what we've done to date up to the end of 2022. There's a really valuable document library where we've got a suite of fact sheets which provide further information from what's been shared tonight. But then importantly, there's a live survey that we're proposing to keep live well and truly into the end of this year, where it creates an opportunity for you to be able to share your thoughts and insights and ask questions about the project and the information that you have and the information that you would like to know. And importantly, all of your feedback will seriously be considered as part of our approvals process. There is also a register on our contact page on our website, which is the final page on our website, where you may want to continue to stay involved and connected to the project. So we'd love for anybody that you know that you might be able to pass that link through to your networks and share the information that comes on hand. Outside of this program, our engagement team are continuing to do a lot of work with a lot of key stakeholders. So we work closely with our technical reference group. We work really closely with a Gippsland-based stakeholder liaison group. We meet regularly, unpacking lots of different discussion on the ground in both Tasmania and Victoria. But importantly, we're spending a lot of time and investing a lot of care and energy into our First Nations engagement. Really proud to be involved in this work, and we have 2 fabulous Aboriginal engagement advisors that are on staff at Marinus Link that are helping us to guide this really important work. And Kate, who mentioned earlier the underwater cultural heritage component of the EIS process, that's some fascinating work that we're continuing to unpack and share with traditional owners in both Victoria and Tasmania. A couple of milestones that we've been able to achieve in this space: the establishment of an Aboriginal advisory group in Victoria, representative of the Bunurong Land and Sea Council, the Bunurong Land Council Aboriginal Corporation, and the Gunai-Kurnai Land and Waters Aboriginal Corporation. And excitingly, we've started to engage in depth across the Bass Strait and with First Nations community in Tasmania, including the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centres, the local land council, and also directly with community members and leaders. Importantly, through this suite of engagement activities, all of the technical reports that Kate spoke to, I think no less than 22, will be available in a public exhibition period towards the end of this year, early next year, as part of the approvals process. But I'd like to just remind everybody that there is the opportunity to complete the survey that was mentioned earlier. What we will be doing for everybody who's participated tonight is we'll be sending an email of thanks for joining us, but also providing a link directly to that page where you can share your thoughts through that survey. And a reminder that that is open until at least the end of this year. And we would love no more than for you to share that amongst your networks. That would be invaluable. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Well, we've come to question time. That's the end of our presentations. Thank you very much for your participation there. I know there's a lot of information for everybody to digest. Before we get into questions, I do just want to acknowledge that the project is still in the design and approvals phase. So there might be some questions that we're not able to answer today, but we will do our best to answer them offline if that's the case. And we'll also update the website with more information as it becomes available. We had some questions come in prior to the session. So first in best dressed, I'm going to give Wendy Farmer the opportunity to have her question answered first. Wendy asked, with VicGrid having a hands-on approach to the transmission now for Victoria, does that change the Marinus project? And if so, how? And as our panelists come on, I think, Stephen, you're probably best placed to answer that one.
Yeah, thanks, Mandy, and thanks, Wendy, for the question. Yes, so the short answer is we've actually been working quite closely with VicGrid. In fact, actually, one of our team members was there meeting with them and talking with them today. There will be no change to our design or the project based on that. VicGrid are looking at other options for connecting offshore wind in the Gippsland area, but they're quite comfortable with our current state of our design and what we're doing.
And Steve, I might throw you a follow-up one there from Bodie, who's asked whether the connection in Victoria, where the converter station is, does that have any relationship to future connection points for offshore wind transmission?
Okay, it's a slightly harder question to answer. So we have chosen to go to Hazelwood because it's a really strong part of the network. Obviously the old Hazelwood substation, Hazelwood power station was there. So it's a really strong part of the network and a really good place to connect Marinus. Now, it's highly likely that other connecting parties like wind farms may also choose to go and connect there. But that's not really in our control or part of our project. They will need to work with AEMO around that. They also may want to connect to other places like Liang. Stuart, do you want to add some more to that?
Yeah, I guess the very simple answer, yeah, we've discussed this with AEMO, with a jurisdictional planner in Victoria, as well as VicGrid, and so ultimately the extension of the 500 kV terminal station that was shown in that image is being specified by them, and all of the suggestions have been that it will include future space to potentially connect future assets in. So future stuff is being accounted for, but how much of it gets used, it'll ultimately depend on those proponents.
Thanks very much, Stephen and Stuart. Kate, I think this one's probably for you. Willie's asked, what's the defined area of indirect influence of the project in the EIA, EIS? And I'm going to take that to mean the corridor that you're examining. He's after just the idea of the magnitude of the project.
Yeah, great question. So I'll just from Tasmania and then Bass Strait and then to Victoria. So Tasmania, we've got the converter station site that we own in Haybridge. And Stewie might be able to give us an area of that particular location. The two cables crossing Bass Strait, they're 2 kilometres apart, and we've got a 10-metre area of disturbance around those. That was part of the calculations. And in Victoria, we've got 90 kilometres, which we've surveyed 220 metres. That's the full width, 110 from either side of the centre line. And then that was the survey area. 36 metres is the construction corridor, and then ultimately down into the 20-metre easement that will end up at the end. We've also got some laydown areas, including and drill pads for the HDD. So as part of our referral at the moment, in short, in Victoria, about 340 hectares is what we are looking at as our potential area of influence in Victoria. Obviously, that will come down significantly after construction, but that's the hopefully that answers that question you're after.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kate. I love it when someone can just reel the figures off like that. Kate, a follow-up for you from Wendy. Wendy's interested in understanding who's doing the cultural heritage and marine ecology studies.
So both, the cultural heritage are being done by ELA, Ecological Australia, who are a Victorian-based organisation who do lots around there. And the marine ecology are done by CEE, Proprietary Limited, Scott Chidley, who's also, they're very expert in those. Our major consultants are Tetra Tech Coffee International, and so these are subbies and with our agreement as well, have chosen the best in the industry. So
fantastic. Thanks very much, Kate. Mark, I've got one for you from Bodhi. Bodhi's interested in the geographic area that's been defined for local businesses and local jobs. Can you help with that one? Yeah,
great question. Thanks for joining, Bodhi. As you would probably be aware, that local in general sense in government terms is Australia-wide, but be assured that we are really focusing a lens on ensuring that we have a more regional approach to that. Really important that we connect through the networks like Grow Gippsland, specifically in the Gippsland region. But we also recently, really excitingly, a new member to the team in an economic development principal role that has just joined us and has already hit the ground running and starting to commence the development of our industry participation plan, which really focuses on the local benefit and local opportunities. So working not only with industry, but education as well, to make sure that we're as prepared as we can be before we start to turn sod.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Mark. Stephen, back to you. Wendy's asked about the tendering. You've shortlisted international companies. Did any Australian companies tender?
Okay, so no, there are no manufacturers in Australia who could actually build the equipment that we need, unfortunately. So we had to go international. So we've got 4 cable manufacturers from overseas and 3 converter manufacturers from overseas. They will, though, of course, need to partner with local companies to actually do the construction in Australia. And also next year when we do the civil works, that will be targeted, expect to be Australian companies.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Mark, back to you again. Wendy's asked, have you considered how you'll communicate with communities who might be having issues through the construction phase? Yeah,
thank you, Wendy, for the question. We'll certainly be having communications and engagement expectations and plans through our contractors through the development of the project and when it's being constructed, so that they adhere to standards and that we can stay communicated with those that are mostly impacted within the cable alignment in Gippsland, but also in Tasmania at the Haybridge site.
Great, thanks, Mark. I think this one might be for you too. So this one's just come in from somebody anonymously. Does the Marinus Link project expect to provide any initial or ongoing community benefit funding?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and one that we're going to be spending a lot of time on over the coming months in developing. We don't at this stage is the short answer, but recently the organisation has delved really deeply into a sustainability framework, which will set the guideline and the base for us to start the conversations, not only internally, but with community with regards to what the expectations are around community benefits. It's such a large scale project, so the expectation is that we do speak with community around what that might look like. But I would imagine that that's probably going to commence in the next 6 months or so.
I might just add in there that the Victorian government's just recently announced effectively a community benefit sharing scheme for landowners impacted by the assets. We're still looking to understand a bit more of the detail around that and how that will impact Marinus, but that's likely to involve ongoing payments to landowners who are impacted by the infrastructure.
Thanks, Stephen. Now, we don't have any more questions queued up, but so what I might do, Stephen, is hand over to you. We did have one last slide that just has some information on it for people who are interested in potentially being involved in the project.
Okay, actually there might be two last
Stephen,
slides.
if Crystal, if you could share that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So firstly, have talked about suppliers. So we're on the ICN, the Industry Capability Network in Victoria and Tasmania. So we would really encourage people who are potentially to be able to be service providers to register on that portal. There's a link there on the slides. There's also a link on our website to how you register for the that ICN. You can there identify which areas and what sort of services you can provide. We will be pointing and have been pointing our international suppliers to that portal, and also next year when we're looking at more of our local civil works using that portal as well. So I encourage everyone to do that. And I think there's one more slide. We've been plugging pretty hard. Please, we want to hear your opinion. So once again, just a link there. Go onto our website. Please click on the survey, take the survey, share us your thoughts. It's really valuable for us to understand what you're thinking. And having it in a survey format means we can sort of do the sort of analysis and that along with it as well. The website's got a lot of great information on it. Not only what we've been doing today in terms of the webinars, there's lots of the historical stuff around the economic analysis. There's lots of fact sheets around the design and construction methodologies there. So we'll plug to, want to learn more, go to our website there as well. And I think there's also contact information. You can come back and ask more questions as well. Okay.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
Thanks, Stephen. Now we do have one last question. I gave everybody a last chance to post. So I've got Mark coming back online. So Mark, I'm going to throw that one to you. Do you have an understanding yet of any housing requirements and the impacts or benefits for local communities during construction around that?
Yeah, housing's a big issue, and it doesn't matter where you go with any large project like this, a consideration of the impacts that has not only to the local community, but the opportunity for construction that's travelling to come into an area and what that has. We will be developing a housing strategy. We're unpacking at the moment what the local needs are currently, what the landscape is, but what the need will be throughout the construction period in both Tasmania and Victoria. So that's under development at the moment, but we are have a keen eye on understanding the local impacts already. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. Well, that seems to have concluded our questions. So for everybody online, that concludes our session today. Thank you very much to our panelists for their presentation. And thanks again to everybody online again for giving up your time this evening to hear a little more about the project. We really do appreciate it. So thanks again, everybody, and goodbye for now.